Christopher Nolan has spent his entire career making films about obsession, creation, and the danger of wanting to know how the thing works. And in revisiting many of his films, I couldn't help but notice how so many of these films are just about filmmaking themselves. You can often place him as the surrogate, being the protagonist of these films. And with so many hits, it's easy to see why he is one of the most popular filmmakers of the modern era. And here is my personal ranking of all 12 of those films. In 12th place, I have The Dark Knight Rises. This has always been the Christopher Nolan film that I've struggled with the most. And on rewatch, that feeling essentially remains the same. Part of that may be because it's following up one of my favorite films of all time, which creates an almost impossible standard to meet. I understand what Nolan was trying to do, tell a story about a broken Bruce Wayne facing his greatest physical and emotional challenge, but the execution doesn't always work for me. The biggest issue is that the film is simply not that engaging. Bane creates some impressive spectacle, and Tom Hardy's physical performance is memorable, but the character never connects with me in a way Nolan's best villains do. The voice is distracting, and the mask limits the emotional presence that made someone like the Joker so compelling. Anne Hathaway's Catwoman is easily the highlight of the film, bringing the energy and complexity that the rest of the movie sometimes lacks, but even she can't overcome some of the more questionable choices, including the rushed ending and the decision to set up Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character as Batman's successor. It's an ambitious conclusion to the trilogy, but for me, it's Nolan's weakest film. Insomnia is a solid thriller, but one of his least memorable films. It just doesn't have that same ambitious storytelling or mind-bending structure that would become his trademark, but it still delivers an engaging mystery from start to finish. One of the biggest draws is simply getting to watch Al Pacino and Robin Williams share the screen. Williams, in particular, is excellent in a rare villainous role. What really helps the film stand out is its setting. The story takes place during Alaska's period of constant daylight, and Nolan uses that phenomenon to great effect, turning the never-ending sunlight into a source of psychological tension. It's clever use of location that gives the film an identity, even if it doesn't rank among Nolan's most unforgettable works. Following feels like a film school exercise expanding into a feature-length narrative. That's not necessarily criticism. It actually makes for a fascinating watch, especially if you're familiar with Christopher Nolan's later work. You can already see so many of the ideas and techniques that would define his career. The fractured storytelling, the obsession with perspective, and the puzzle box structure. At the same time, some of the weaknesses are there too, with characters that can feel more like pieces of a concept than fully realized people. It's not Nolan's most riveting film, but it never becomes dull either. Even on first watch, it's engaging enough to keep you invested, and as a debut, it's an impressive glimpse of a filmmaker whose voice was already starting to take shape. Dunkirk in some ways feels like a backtrack for Christopher Nolan, almost like a return to the kind of film school experimentation that defined some of his earlier work. The concept is built around the structure of the storytelling, the three timelines unfolding at different speeds, and while that approach is technically impressive, I'm not convinced this was the strongest story to apply that experiment to. Of course, Nolan's strengths as a filmmaker are still very much on display. The scale is massive, the tension is consistently maintained, and the action sequences are executed with incredible precision. The use of practical effects and sound design create levels of immersion that few filmmakers can match. But where Dunkirk struggles for me is the emotional connection. By the time the credits roll, there isn't much that stays with you in terms of the characters themselves, which makes the film less rewarding to revisit compared to Nolan's strongest work. It's an impressive technical achievement, but not necessarily his most engaging films. The Prestige is one of Christopher Nolan's most fascinating films because on the surface it's a story about a rivalry between two magicians, but underneath it's really a film about obsession, sacrifice, and the art of storytelling itself. The performances from Hugh Jackman and Christian Bale are fantastic, with both characters becoming consumed by their need to outdo the other. While the big twist doesn't necessarily hold up strongly once you know the secret, the film actually becomes more interesting because of what it's saying about the secrets and reveals. Nolan uses the world of magic as an analogy for filmmaking, exploring our desires to understand how the trick works while reminding us that the true power of the great trick comes from the presentation. The audience may want to know the secret, but the experience of the illusion is what really matters. Memento is the film where Christopher Nolan's ambition fully clicks into place. It's a bold, creative swing and somehow completely pays off. The film playing in reverse isn't just a gimmick. It puts you in the same disoriented state as the main character, making the mystery all the more immersive. It's an incredible, engaging first watch, but what really makes Memento special is how rewarding it becomes on repeat viewings. Once you know the full picture, you're able to appreciate just how carefully everything is constructed. It also continues many of the themes and storytelling techniques that would become staples of Nolan's career: fractured timelines, unreliable perspectives, and a protagonist driven by obsession. It's the film that proved Christopher Nolan wasn't just experimenting, he had a distinct voice. Tenet might be Christopher Nolan's most ambitious concept, even if the execution doesn't always live up to the brilliance of the idea. The concept of inversion and experiencing time two different directions is incredibly creative, and it's the type of original blockbuster filmmaking that feels rare. At times, though, the film struggles to create the emotional connection needed to make the audience fully invested. The characters can feel more like pieces moving through Nolan's massive puzzle rather than people we deeply connect with, and the emotional stakes don't always land strongly as they should. But the interesting thing about Tenet is that the creativity is so impressive that you almost forget those shortcomings. Nolan once again creates set pieces and action sequences that feel unlike anything else, and the sheer ambition of the filmmaking keeps you engaged. It may not be his most successful film emotionally, but it's a reminder that Nolan's one of the few directors willing to take huge risks on original ideas on a blockbuster scale. Batman Begins is one of the greatest superhero origin films ever made. Instead of treating Batman like a larger-than-life comic book icon, Christopher Nolan grounds him in a believable world, showing not just how Bruce Wayne became Batman, but why. That grounded approach completely changed the way audiences view the character on the big screen and helped redefine what superhero movies could be. Another smart decision is the restraint Nolan shows with the villains. Rather than jumping straight to Batman's biggest rogues, he builds the world using characters like Scarecrow and Ra's al Ghul, allowing Bruce Wayne's journey to remain the focus. It's a confident, character-driven start to a trilogy that will go on to become one of the most influential within the genre. Inception is one of those films that on recent rewatch has some flaws, a little bit more noticeable than they were when I first saw it the summer of 2010. But that's also what makes Christopher Nolan such a fascinating filmmaker. He's a master at distracting you from those imperfections by creating an experience that's so ambitious, that's so engaging, that you get swept up in it. The set pieces remain some of the most impressive of his career, whether it's a train crashing through a city street, buildings folding over themselves, or a hallway fight where gravity completely changes. Nolan's ability to turn abstract concepts into massive cinematic moments is unmatched. That being said, I do wish the dream sequences lean more into the limitless possibilities of dreaming instead of feeling like increasingly elaborate action sequences. There's also the familiar criticism of Nolan's female characters, with Mal once again serving primarily as motivation for the male protagonist. But even with those issues, the emotional core of Inception still works, and the ambiguity of the final shot remains one of the greatest endings in modern film. Oppenheimer remains one of Christopher Nolan's greatest accomplishments, proving that blockbuster filmmaking can still be ambitious, challenging, and worthy of the highest level of critical recognition. On paper, a 3-hour biopic about the creation of the atomic bomb might not sound like the most immediate exciting premise, but Nolan turns it into a gripping character study about ambition, consequence, and the weight of discovery. A huge part of what makes the film work is the incredible ensemble, with countless A-list performances bringing different perspectives to this historical moment. But underneath all of that is the central moral question that drives the entire film. Should humanity continue pursuing progress simply because it is possible, even when that progress has the potential to cause unimaginable harm? Nolan doesn't offer an easy answer, instead creating a film that is much about the person behind the achievement as it is about the achievement itself. It's a massive cinematic event, proving that a blockbuster can also be intellectually demanding and deeply reflective. Interstellar is a generational sci-fi film that works best when you fully embrace its sincerity. Christopher Nolan isn't afraid to make a movie about huge ideas: space exploration, humanity's future, and the power of love. And that emotional openness is what makes the film stand out. The scope is massive, with some of the most unforgettable set pieces in Nolan's career, from the docking sequence to the exploration of worlds where time itself becomes the obstacle. In many ways, this might be Nolan's best use of time as a storytelling device, taking a scientific concept and turning it into something deeply personal. It can also not be overstated how much Hans Zimmer's score elevates the entire experience, becoming one of the most iconic elements of the film. More than any other Nolan film, Interstellar is the one that hits me emotionally, balancing the filmmaker's obsession with complex ideas with a genuine sense of wonder and also humanity. The Dark Knight is one of those those movies where the experience of seeing it for the first time in the summer of 2008, it's almost impossible to recreate. It felt like a major cultural event. Christopher Nolan didn't just make a great Batman movie, he completely changed how superhero films could be viewed. It was a crime drama, a character study, and an epic blockbuster all at the same time. And its success helped push the conversation around superhero films into places they had rarely gone before, including becoming part of the larger discussion about what films could be considered for major awards. Of course, the biggest reason the movie continues to stand above everything else is Heath Ledger's performance as the Joker, which remains the greatest performance we've ever seen in a comic book film. Combined with unforgettable set pieces and a story that feels just as powerful today, The Dark Knight became so influential that it almost worked against the films that followed it. Countless movies tried to copy its darker tone and grounded approach, but most failed because they were chasing the surface without understanding what made a Nolan film so special. So those are my rankings of all of Christopher Nolan's films. I would love to hear where you disagree, so please let me know below, and I will see you next time.